In 839.M30, the First Legion came home from a world called Advex-mors with 5,000 dead, 4 months of fighting, 5,000 Astartes, and the place they had just fought their way across wasn't a homeworld, wasn't a capital, wasn't even a significant military installation. It was a minor garrison at the edge of an empire nobody in the Imperium had known existed. A single Rangdan war moon, one of the mobile fortresses the Rangda fielded as naval capital assets, had held against the combined firepower of 3 Gloriana-class battleships, the largest warships humanity had ever built. 3 Glorianas against 1 war moon, and the Imperium had prevailed only by sacrificing one of those irreplaceable vessels in a final assault. What they had achieved at that cost was the destruction of an outpost garrison. The Imperium had no idea what it had just poked. 23 years later, in 862 M30, the Rangda responded, not with one fleet, with thousands of vessels and more than a dozen war moons, striking simultaneously from the galactic north and east. Entire expeditionary fleets died without a single survivor. Worlds fell in days. Titan legions, entire orders of the greatest war machines humanity had ever built, were obliterated as organized units. The 5th and 19th legions reached the forge world of Xenocide ahead of the tide and held for 8 months, 3,000 Astartes dead, hundreds of thousands of Mechanicum forces gone, buying time for the Dark Angels and Death Guard to break the siege and cut a counterattack corridor into Rangdan space. What followed was more than 2 decades of war across 19 destroyed star systems. More than half a legion's fighting strength spent in a single campaign phase, on top of already substantial losses from the previous 2. By 899 M30, the Ultramarines had overtaken the Dark Angels as the most numerous Space Marine legion, a position the First would never reclaim. Imperial army losses were recorded as millions, and then apparently stopped being carefully counted. In 881 M30, an incident called the Majin-Torque transgression sent the Death Guard chasing a base mechanic bark that broke through the Imperial cordon. The Death Guard were decimated by what they found inside before the Space Wolves intervened to prevent a wider catastrophe. Even the cleanup operations generated their own disasters. The primary sources call these campaigns one of the most apocalyptic the Great Crusade had yet produced. Losses that wouldn't recur until the Fratricidal War, until the Horus Heresy itself. That comparison belongs to the record, not to commentary. By the measurement of those who lived through them, the Rangdan Xenocides cost humanity the equivalent of a galaxy-spanning civil war. After the second Xenocide ended, the surviving veterans were sworn to silence or eliminated. Tainted worlds were abandoned without public notation. The records surrounding the conflict were sealed long ago. What survived despite the purge is described in official records as muddled and often contradictory. At least one world was reportedly mislabeled in Imperial reports to lend more weight to claims of complete extermination. The Imperium adjusted the geography of its own victory to make the victory appear more complete than it was. The Imperium has a list of its greatest victories, and the Rangdan Xenocides aren't on it. 3 campaigns, more than 50 years. Over 50,000 Dark Angels dead in the 3rd Xenocide alone, millions of Imperial army, dozens of Titan legions, an enemy described as the most infamous among scholars of the Forbidden, and no monument, no feast day, no carved name on any wall. The official story is that the Rangdan were simply that terrible, that a Xenos horror nearly ended the Great Crusade, the Imperium prevailed, and the trauma justified the silence. But that official story has a problem. The problem is a pattern. Primarchs don't die to aliens.
That needs to be demonstrated precisely, because the entire weight of what follows rests on it.
Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands died at the drop site massacre on Istvan-V. Fulgrim, his closest friend among the Primarchs, his honor brother, the man he had exchanged weapons with as a pledge of eternal friendship, decapitated him on the killing field while Horus's trap closed around the loyalist legions. The blade Fulgrim carried was possessed by a chaos demon. The cause of death: a brother Primarch empowered by chaos, at the opening act of a chaos-orchestrated civil war. Sanguinius of the Blood Angels died aboard the Vengeful Spirit during the Siege of Terra. Horus Lupercal, the War Master, chaos ascended and cosmically empowered, killed him in direct combat after Sanguinius refused to the last to join the rebellion. The cause: a brother Primarch fully committed to chaos, at the peak of his demonic investment. At the climax of the war, chaos had spent centuries engineering. Conrad Kurz of the Night Lords was killed by Meshen, a Calidus assassin, a human Imperial agent. He allowed it to happen. He had prophesied his own death and chose to fulfill the prophecy rather than prevent it, presenting himself and doing nothing to stop her. Killed by a human being, one specific woman, with the full cooperation of the man being killed. Robute Guilliman was mortally wounded at the Battle of Thessala by the demon prince Fulgrim, chaos ascended, wielding a blade whose taint placed Guilliman in suspended stasis for 10,000 years. The cause: chaos corruption, wielded by a traitor brother. Lion L. Johnson was brought down on Caliban by Luther, a human, his mentor, the man who had named him and raised him from the Calibanite forests. Luther's jealousy had had decades to curdle, and chaos had found the wound and poisoned it. The most powerful warrior in the First Legion was incapacitated by a human being whose greatest weapon was a grudge the lion had never noticed he'd created. Rogel Dorn disappeared during a boarding action against a chaos fleet. Leman Russ vanished voluntarily into the Eye of Terror. Magnus the Red, Mortarion, Lorgar, Angron, Perturabo, Fulgrim, all willingly ascended into demonhood through chaos. Every confirmed fate, every permanent removal, chaos, or a brother, or a human agent. One honest exception requires acknowledgement. Jagatai Khan of the White Scars disappeared while pursuing Drukhari raiders into the webway after they attacked his homeworld. His fate is listed in canon as unknown, not confirmed dead, status missing. This disappearance occurred after the heresy, not during the Great Crusade. His fate remains unresolved. That exception acknowledged, the pattern holds for the entire Great Crusade itself. No Primarch was confirmed killed or permanently incapacitated by a non-chaos Xenos enemy during the 50 years of Imperial expansion, until the second Primarch. His entry in the official Primarch rediscovery table reads, "Records redacted. No name, no Legion name, no homeworld, no date of discovery. The number 2 and a blank. A wartime document recovered in Imperial archives, a field guide issued to Solar Auxilia troops during the Rangdan campaigns, lists the 2nd and 11 legions as deployed alongside those troops to fight the Rangda. He was there. His legion was there. Then neither was. The simplest explanation says the war was devastating enough to kill him. Something that catastrophic might be capable of killing a demigod. The Imperium erased the record to protect the narrative that alien enemies can't destroy the Emperor's sons. The silence is shame about a defeat, not concealment of something worse. The simplest explanation doesn't survive contact with how the erasure was actually executed. To understand the mechanism, how a sun crosses over, you have to understand what the Rangda actually were. Two warrior castes, the cerebrivores and the ossivores.
Names drawn from Latin roots. Cerebrum, the brain, and os, the bone. Brain eaters and bone eaters. Horus Heresy, Book 9, describes the Rangda as a vulpine race, fox-like in appearance, towering, of terrifying intellect, technologically capable of matching the Imperium in direct industrial warfare. Their warships trailed spines and flails like metallic tentacles, reminiscent of jellyfish, organic hulls adapted for void combat the Imperium had no counters for at the beginning of the conflict. Associated in primary source material with entities called sloth, murder minds, the sloth being themselves a predatory, cognitively capable species documented across other imperial records for harvesting intelligence from their victims. What made the Rangda operationally unlike anything the Crusade had encountered was what they did to populations they conquered. Neural collars, cognitive override devices applied at industrial scale. A single Rangdan overseer at Advex-mors Extremis controlled a remote garrison of 10,000 slaves simultaneously. 10,000 people whose autonomous will had been replaced by a signal. The Rangda built their armies entirely from controlled populations, humans, xenos, whatever intelligent species fell within reach. They enslaved minds at the scale most civilizations build cities. Book 9 Crusade describes them directly as a race that enslaves other species with mind control. The bio-taint they left behind in conquered territories was severe enough to require a decade of systematic sterilization after the war. Biopogroms that left entire human-inhabited sectors lifeless to ensure what was hoped to be a final victory. The phrase "hope to be" belongs to the primary source. The Imperium wasn't certain the purge had worked. It hoped. Two pathways lead from this foundation to a Primarch standing in the enemy order of battle. The first is supernatural, a race whose warrior castes are literally named brain eaters, associated with psychic murder minds, capable of overriding the cognition of millions of beings through deployed technology. Whether those mechanisms could reach a Primarch-class mind, sons whose souls shine so brightly in the immaterium that they draw the attention of demonic entities regardless of intention, the canonical record doesn't say. What it confirms is that the bio-taint penetrated human physiology so completely that sectors had to be sterilized a generation after the fighting ended. The Rangda operated at the level of populations, not individuals. The question of whether something that could enslave 10,000 minds simultaneously could affect even one that had been engineered at the apex of human potential is one the Imperium has been very careful not to answer. The second pathway requires nothing supernatural. It requires only a Primarch who saw what the Rangda actually were, who witnessed neural collar slavery practiced at industrial scale, who spent years watching his legion bleed in a war where the enemy controlled every tactical condition. Lion L. Johnson, commanding the Dark Angels in these same campaigns, is described in source material as having actively raged at being unable to strike from a position of advantage. The Rangda systematically spoofed Imperial sensors, making ambush the structural default rather than the tactical exception, denying the Lion the capacity to impose his own terms on any engagement. Imagine what that war looked like from inside the Second Legion, year after year. An enemy that turns human populations into weapons. A great crusade conducting systematic exterminatus on inhabited human sectors to purge an alien contamination.
a mission defined as the reunification of humanity requiring the methodical sterilization of human worlds to keep moving forward. A Primarch capable of genuine moral reasoning might look at that reality and arrive at a conclusion nobody in the Imperium had a category for. A conclusion that didn't require chaos to reach. A choice made in full possession of his faculties, in full awareness of what he was doing, which is, in some ways, the version that should disturb us most. During the darkest phase of the Second Xenocide, an agent identifying himself with the Alpha Legion sought an audience with the Lion, offering to secretly take operational control of the war and allow the First Legion to withdraw and rebuild. The Lion rejected the offer. His answer, as the record preserved it, was that the offers change but the answer never does. He stayed. He paid the price. He brought his legion through the grinding decades and out the other side, broken in numbers, altered in spirit but unbroken in loyalty. The second Primarch, by the reading this script argues, crossed a different line. His portrait is assembled entirely from absence, no documented personality, no behavioral patterns, no recorded opinions about anything, no description of what he looked like or how he commanded. We know only that he existed, that his legion was deployed in the worst war the Crusade ever produced, and that both were removed from imperial history with a thoroughness that exceeded what was ever applied to the people who actually launched the Civil War. The gap between his deployment and his erasure contains a story the Imperium has spent millennia ensuring nobody assembles in one place. What the Xenocides cost the First Legion is documented even where the cause isn't. Horus Heresy, Book 6 states it directly. Once the most numerous and powerful of the Space Marine legions, their numbers would be depleted and primacy ended by decades of savage warfare, particularly in the wars of the Rangdan Xenocides, one of the most apocalyptic campaigns of the Great Crusade. The scars of these battles would change them. The numbers behind that statement: 50,000 Dark Angels dead in the Third Xenocide alone, more than half a legion's fighting strength, spent in a single campaign phase on top of already substantial losses from the previous two. By 899 M30, the Ultramarines had overtaken the Dark Angels as the most numerous Space Marine legion, a position the First would never reclaim. The prototype, the Emperor's own first weapon, permanently surpassed. The Space Wolves shared the final purge phase, the bio-pogroms, the sector sterilizations, the task of complete extermination that fell to the First Legion and the Sixth, conducting a decade-long series of biocidal campaigns. The work left both legions with what the records describe as a dark reputation, feared by legions that had spent the same decades winning clean, promotable campaigns. Horus and the Luna Wolves were firmly in the ascendance after the Xenocides. Their legions were intact. Their records had no complicated chapters. The Space Wolves processed the damage and kept moving. They carried the reputation for brutality openly, absorbed it, continued operating. The Dark Angels moved inward. After the Second Xenocide, survivors were sworn to silence or eliminated. Records were sealed. They created the Order of Broken Claws, a specialized formation within their internal structure assigned to guard Rangdan relics and preserve knowledge of a war officially declared over. When the Third Xenocide ended, the Order wasn't disbanded. It was stationed permanently at Advex-mors, the site of the very first battle, maintaining sentinel over an enemy the official record claims was extinct. A legion standing permanent watch over an enemy it has officially killed is a legion that doesn't fully believe its own victory narrative. The standard account of Dark Angel's secrecy starts with the Fallen, Luther's betrayal, Caliban's destruction, the 10,000-year hunt. That account is real. It explains the post-heresy chapter completely. But Book 6 describes the First Legion in the period immediately following the Xenocides, decades before the heresy began, as already unyielding, technologically capable, ruthless, and insular. Insular is the key word. Walls already up before the wound everyone knows about was struck. There is a structural reason for this that predates even the Xenocides. Before Lyon L. Johnson found his legion, the first was organized into a formation called the hexagrammaton, 6 specialized wings, each operating with deliberately partial information, each knowing certain things and specifically kept from knowing others. Compartmentalization as institutional architecture, baked into the First Legion before their Primarch arrived to give it a name. The Lion deepened rather than created this tendency. Malcador the Sigillite's own notes, preserved in Horus Heresy material, describe him in terms that explain why. Of all the Primarchs, save perhaps Mortarion, Lyon L. Johnson stands apart. Partially this is due to his taciturn nature. A brooding silence hangs over him at all times. Yet there is something more, something buried beneath his noble exterior. Perhaps this is a result of his upbringing, growing to maturity alone in the monster-ridden forests of Caliban. Even at a council of war, the lion moves like an apex predator. He is always watching, always planning, always hunting. He unnerves even his brothers. An apex predator who learned as a child that silence was survival, who trained in a place where noise meant death, who watched and planned and hunted and kept his own counsel about everything that mattered to him. Put that Primarch in charge of a legion that had already organized itself around controlled information. Send that combination through 50 years of a war that required systematic elimination of tainted populations and systematic purging of records. And when it's over, give that legion a reason to maintain those disciplines indefinitely. A fragment from Dark Angels fiction, preserved in the novel Angels of Caliban, gives a veteran the line, "We have always been mutable, my friend. The Dark Angels, the first, the 6 hosts of the Angels of Death. Different names for the same thing, always been mutable. A culture that defined itself through its capacity for concealment, for operating under different names without losing its essential shape across any span of time." The theory argued here is that the Dark Angels carry 2 wounds, and everyone only sees the second. The fallen, and Caliban is the visible scar, a betrayal with a named betrayer, a specific roster of the damned, a defined mission that can at least be acted upon even if it can never be completed. The older wound has none of that, only a prohibition. You killed a brother, and you won't speak of it, and you will spend whatever remains of history ensuring that the full truth of what happened during the worst 50 years of the Great Crusade never reaches a single ear that doesn't already carry the secret. The operational demands of that prohibition, sustained across 10 millennia, across an entire legion and all its successor chapters, would produce exactly the culture the Dark Angels have always had. Every century of the record confirms the shape. The Imperium erases things. This is institutional function, not conjecture. The traitor legions who launched the Horus heresy remain in the record, designated excommunicate traitorous. Their names are in the archives. Their crimes are stated. Horus Lupercal, the man who put the emperor on the golden throne, who convinced 8 of his brothers to burn the Imperium from within, exists in the administrative record as a documented, condemned, historically acknowledged enemy. The heresy has been suppressed from general civilian knowledge, reduced to myth, but the institutional records remain. There is a difference between suppression and obliteration. The 2nd and 11th legions receive something different, utterly obliterated, along with their entire legions, by imperial edict. That language is legalistic and precise, and it appears consistently across every source that references the removal. Not sealed, not classified, not preserved at restricted clearance levels for appropriate future review. Obliterated. The records weren't removed from public access. They were removed from the archive itself. Harder treatment than was ever applied to the people who actually launched the Civil War. In Horus Heresy fiction, Lorgar describes 2 of his brothers as having failed, a word he explicitly distinguishes from those who later turned. Failed and turned are separate categories with different moral weights. Turned describes the heresy's arc, the corruption, the tempter, the theology the Imperium developed to explain how sons betray fathers. Failed describes something that happened earlier, outside that framework, before the Imperium had vocabulary for it, which required a response the Imperium didn't have an existing template for. In Horus Heresy material, Vulcan uses the word sanction for what happened to the lost Primarchs, a deliberate, punitive measure, consciously administered against something. Belisarius Call, examining the genetic records millennia later, states the fault wasn't their gene seed but their Primarchs or their Primarchs' actions, not what they were, what they chose to do. Magnus the Red in Horus Heresy fiction refers to his 2 lost brothers with a paired phrase, the forgotten and the purged. Canon uses this collectively for both Primarchs rather than as a technical designation assigning one term to each individual. The inference that purged applies specifically to the 2nd and forgotten to the 11th is a reading from the evidence, not an explicit canonical mapping. But the phrase exists, and the words aren't interchangeable. Forgotten describes absence. Purged describes an action administered with intent. The erasure of the lost legions wasn't forgetting, it was administering. Malcador the Sigillite reportedly possessed a formal instrument to dissolve a legion by direct decree. In Horus Heresy material, this authority is noted as having been used only twice before. The count aligns with 2 missing legions. The mechanism was real and operational. The asymmetry between Lost Legion erasure and Traitor Legion erasure isn't subtle. If the 2nd Primarch had died fighting the Rangda, martyred, slain in battle, sacrificed at the worst war of the age, the Imperium had mechanisms for that outcome too. Sealed memorial records, a name preserved in restricted archives accessible to appropriate clearance levels, an honorable absence that maintained the fact of the person's existence and sacrifice. The Imperium has done this before for sensitive deaths it can't safely publicize. What was done to the lost legions was categorically different from that, and it was categorically harsher than what was done to the War Master himself. There is one genuine vulnerability in the argument about no Primarch dying to aliens, and it deserves to be stated plainly. The pattern might be partially constructed by the same erasure under examination. If the 2nd Primarch died fighting the Rangda, the Imperium had both the motive and the demonstrated capability to delete that record. The no Xenos deaths pattern could be circular. The one potential exception is the one whose record was removed. That possibility is real, but it cuts both ways. If the Imperium was capable of removing the record of an honorable death, it was equally capable of removing the record of a treasonous one. The question isn't whether the machinery for deletion exists. It clearly does. The question is which kind of deletion the specific language points toward. Sanction. failed, obliterated by imperial edict, treatment harsher than the war master received.
This language fits action taken against something living at the time the order was administered, not grief compressed around something lost, not shame about a defeat. Punishment directed at a target. The strongest competing explanation requires its full hearing before reaching any verdict. The second Primarch was killed by the Rangdan. The Xenocides were the most destructive war the Great Crusade ever produced. Something that cost over 50,000 Dark Angels in a single campaign phase, millions of Imperial army, and required the Emperor's personal intervention to resolve, might be capable of killing a demigod. The Imperium erased the record to protect the narrative that alien enemies can't prove superior to the Emperor's sons, because to acknowledge a Primarch lost to Xenos is to acknowledge that the Rangda were, in some sense, the Emperor's biological equals, and the Imperial truth can't survive that admission. The silence is shame about a defeat, not concealment of something worse. This reading is simpler. It requires fewer moving parts. It has substantial support among people who know this material carefully and have engaged it seriously for years. Anyone arguing for defection over honorable death has to acknowledge that the simpler reading has genuine merit, and that the impulse to reach for a more dramatic explanation doesn't automatically make the dramatic explanation correct. The honest response is that the honorable death reading doesn't fully account for the punishment. Martyrs don't receive harder erasure than the War Master. An honorably slain Primarch, even one whose death humiliated the Imperium, would receive at minimum a sealed memorial, the kind of restricted record that acknowledges the death without broadcasting it. The Lost Legions received deletion. The distinction between those two outcomes requires an explanation the honorable death reading doesn't supply without additional assumptions of its own. Three threads from the canonical record converge, none individually decisive, together harder to dismiss than any single explanation accounts for. First, the Second Legion was deployed in the Rangdan Xenocides, documented in a wartime field guide issued to Solar Auxilia troops and preserved in the Imperial Archive record. He was there, and his legion was there, in the campaign whose records were subsequently sealed by the legion most directly involved. Second, the erasure was administered with punitive language pointing toward action taken against active treachery, obliterated by imperial edict, sanction, failed, treatment harsher than was ever applied to the actual traitors of the heresy. That language is consistent with deliberate betrayal, and inconsistent with the honorable death of a loyal Primarch the Imperium found embarrassing. Third, the Rangdan Xenocides are the only major Imperial conflict where a Primarch-linked disappearance coincides with the Dark Angels being granted singular personal authority to purge the historical record, and exercising that authority not just on the enemy's biology, but on the entire shape of what happened across 50 years of war. These three threads don't prove the defection. They make it the reading that accounts for the most anomalies while requiring the fewest additional assumptions. The simplest reading that fits all the evidence. The Rangda are gone. Their last worlds were reduced to glass and ash in the 890s.M30, scoured clean across a methodical year of extermination by the Dark Angels and Space Wolves working in grim tandem. The second Primarch is gone. His name, his face, his legion's history, the world where the Emperor found him, the date of his rediscovery, removed from every archive the Imperium maintains.
The First Legion stands permanent sentinel at Advex-mors, guarding relics of an enemy officially declared extinct, maintaining a watch that would make no institutional sense if the victory had been as complete and final as the official record requires. Book 6 describes the Dark Angels emerging from the Xenocides as unyielding, technologically capable, ruthless, and insular.
4 words chosen by people trying to describe something visible in the Legion's behavior that they couldn't quite explain from the outside. Unyielding isn't a compliment in context. Unyielding is what you call something that can't bend, because bending would break it. A legion carrying a secret older than the heresy, too large to speak and too dangerous to forget, would look exactly like that in every source that examined them from outside the walls, and wondered why the walls were so high. During the darkest phase of the second Xenocide, Lion L. Johnson was offered a way out. An agent representing the Alpha Legion offered to secretly assume operational command, allowing the first to withdraw and rebuild. The Lion rejected it. The offers change. The answer never does. He meant constancy in the face of manipulation. He meant that no offer, however cleverly constructed, would turn him from a path once chosen. Carry that line forward 10,000 years, through every question the Imperium has ever put to the Dark Angels about the sealed chapters of their history. The answer never does. Every version of the question meets the same wall. Somewhere in the sealed archives of the First Legion there is a document, an after-action report, a field inquest, a classified assessment from the worst 50 years in the history of the Great Crusade, that is the most honest record the Imperium ever produced about what happened in those campaigns. It names, in the enemy order of battle, a Primarch, not as a casualty on the Imperial side, as a commander on the Rangdan side. That document is why the Rangdan Xenocides carry no triumph narrative, no feast day, no carved name on any wall across the million worlds of the Imperium. The Imperium will celebrate 1,000 smaller wars. It will mark lesser victories in 10,000 places, but it won't speak of this one. Because to celebrate it, you would have to name what you fought. And what you fought, on the worst day of the entire Great Crusade, was family. Subscribe for more stories like this.